This project, when it's completed in early 26, will have taken approximately 8 years. And that does not include the planning before we actually started design, which was probably about another 5 years before that. And just a reminder, Sandy was in 2012, so it was about 13 years ago. So we are, again, we're getting there, but we're still sort of behind the 8 ball when it comes to actually planning and executing this resiliency infrastructure. So this project stretches from State Street and Battery Place, along the Battery, across Pier Plaza, which is just to our south, runs through Wagner Park, and then ties in at First Place here at the Battery by the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And when looking at the project, we did take a sort of bespoke approach, which ties into what I was saying before about how you maintain existing spaces while still putting in the infrastructure needed. I would say the one exception to that is Wagner Park. The original Wagner Park, which opened in 1997, was a fairly passive space, but one that was much beloved by the community. But in order to reach the 19.5 design flood elevation for the project, which is right in the center of the park, we had to elevate it approximately 10.5 feet. But in other locations, especially here around Museum of Jewish Heritage, what we did was that we took sort of a piece-by-piece approach to looking at the building, looking at the ground floor uses, and designing a flood protection system that actually worked with the building every other day than the day that it was deployed during a storm. So on the first floor of this building, you have basically glass-top flood walls, where part of it is about half height and the rest is covered with glass, which mirrors the windows that are in the classroom spaces on the first floor. And at the entrances and at First Place, we have flip-up gates as the means to actually protect against the flooding. As I said, we come to an elevation. I wish I could step out a little bit more so you could see, but the top of the pavilion in Wagner Park is 19.5, the design flood elevation. In order to do this, we looked at a lot of different ways. We were asked to look at also using the existing building as flood protection. That was something that was not feasible. So in this particular instance, we buried the flood wall and used a series of ramps and staircases to get up to the building's elevation. And as we come around Wagner Park, we also, which you'll see images of this, we took an area along Pier, which is maintained by the authority, and took away the riprap edge and actually created a natural habitat there where one did not exist, and also created an opportunity for the public to get out over the water, which also did not exist in this location. And as we go across Pier Plaza, here at Pier, this is about 6 feet. It's the lowest elevation throughout the site. The Pier building during Sandy was actually under renovation and suffered significant damage and had to be re-renovated, I would say, at no small cost. So what we were trying to do is obviously elevating a pier-supported historic building is not really an option. So what we chose to do was to create a bi-level Pier Plaza that would allow certain areas to flood and then would allow other areas, and especially Battery Place, to be protected. So we have 3 flip-up gates there as we tie into, I would say, the most complicated part of our project in many ways, which is the area along the Battery. Here we had to bridge significant subsurface infrastructure, including the Battery Underpass, the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, and subway tunnels for the 1 train, as we basically tie into this area at State Street and Battery Place. No small feat, but also not unusual when it comes to developing these projects in New York City. You have to work around what you discover underground, which is not always visible on drawings or maps or any public record. So in order to do that, we took a different approach here. We took an above-ground flood wall, which is not insignificant, along the Battery Place entrance. We did this work in coordination with the Battery Conservancy, the Parks Department, and also the Public Design Commission to develop an entryway for the Battery along Battery Place, but also providing the flood protection that was required. So the wall is very significant here and basically dies down into a planted berm area until we get to the tie-in point. So, like I said to start, we really took a piece-by-piece, sort of incredibly bespoke approach to how we would address the flood needs across the project. Now for the fun part, which is more of the rendered view. So this is the rendered view of Wagner Park, which is right outside our window. As you can see, this is the ramping and the stairs I was telling you about to get to the top the new pavilion. In this design, what we also wanted to make sure we did, which was really a key sort of feature of the original pavilion, was that the two sides of the pavilion met and you had these unobstructed views of the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. So in this new design, we kept that same archway so that you would maintain that same view that existed prior. And this is another view from one of the terraced areas in the park. This is looking towards Museum of Jewish Heritage. Within the park, too, we manage drainage by having a 60,000 gallon cistern underneath the park. That's for water reuse on site. So it helps with some of the drainage issues, but also is a nice sort of eco feature that we have on the site. We're also pursuing ILFI zero carbon for the building. This is the view of Pier Inlet I was discussing, where we've created a planted edge where one was a complete riprap edge before. And as you can see on the far end, that's the platform that actually goes over the water and allows access that wasn't currently available before to the public. I should also say that this project was WEDG verified by the Waterfront Alliance. And this is the South LA going towards the pavilion. Another design feature that we brought back was that the original pavilion had a north and a south LA of trees. As part of the design, we did bring back the LAs, which you can see we just planted about 2 weeks ago outside. This is the bi-level Pier Plaza. These are the stairs to get up and where we have flip-up gates across the plaza. And this is the battery flood wall. As I said, it's fairly large and very visible, but this is the flood wall. There's a flip-up gate, which is roughly around where the vent for the tunnel is, and then the other side dives into the berm at State Street, the battery. We did not do this on our own. We had a very significant design team involved in the project. We also had tremendous coordination with numerous city agencies. The challenge with not tying it on our own property is that we had to do a lot of significant work on other people's property, which we can't just go do sort of without their oversight and their feedback. So this is just sort of an overview of the agencies we coordinated with on this project and our broader design team who worked both on the landscape side, but also the pavilion building, and our construction team, which involves multiple also contractors of the project. And that is my presentation. I'm happy to take questions. I also love no questions. That's also fine. Oh. That is a great question, and permitting and regulatory frameworks are kind of my favorite thing. So as part of this project, as I mentioned, we had to deal with a lot of agencies, but also from a regulatory perspective, we were subject to review by Department of Environmental Conservation, the Army Corps of Engineers, and also the New York City Department of Small Business Services. That may not make sense to some, but SBS is currently in charge of waterfront construction permitting in the city. So we had to go through sort of 3 layers of permitting to do what is a fairly limited amount of in-water work, which is really isolated to the Pier Inlet work. But going through that review is sort of a multi-layered, similar review where comments often don't line up. Comments are often conflicting, and it's challenging to determine sort of how you're responsive, but also how you're responsive and maintain your design vision, and you don't modify it so significantly that it changes into something else entirely. So I think, given the limited jurisdiction on this project, it was a lot of back and forth with the regulatory agencies, just sort of explaining why we were doing it. The inlet was in particular because it was sort of a very sort of not pretty New York City waterway condition. I'm trying to be very diplomatic about the way I describe it. It was ugly, and it had a bulkhead that sort of jutted out into the water that we wound up demolishing. Sort of convincing that this was a better option than what was there was, incredibly challenging to make that case, even though I think if you look at the visual of it, the case is very obvious. But I think that since Sandy, the regulatory environment is changing still. I think when you look at trying to permit any one of these projects, I would say in 2014 or 2015, it would be much more impossible to do. I think that regulators are understanding the need a lot more and trying to be as flexible as they can be while still sort of defending what they're required to do by law. And so I hope that, you know, in the future, the next 5-10 years, we have an even more flexible regulatory environment. But I would say when I worked for the state previously, immediately post-Sandy on resiliency work, you could not get anything permitted that was in water. So we have made progress. It's just, you know, not as quickly as it needs to be to protect, you know, the 520 miles of waterfront from future storms. That was a very long answer to your question, but I hope it answered your question.
Given the long time frame of this project, have you had to make modifications that you had not anticipated when you started? And if so, what were they?
I think we had to, from when the project started design, even to when we finished design, over that 4-year period, I would say there were significant changes we probably didn't anticipate making. Some were due to agency feedback. Some were due to, as I said earlier, things we found that we didn't know existed in the ground, which sounds kind of crazy. Battery Park City is new when it comes to Manhattan. Battery Park City was developed in the 1970s, which sounds new, but is still old in terms of quality record keeping or consistency in records. And so, you know, even when we were doing construction, we had to modify some work. We would find utility lines that were not on any map, not on any drawing, and had to be rerouted. We would find, you know, Battery Park City is built on a pile-supported platform, and there are landfill areas. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of it is pile-supported. And so you're also super limited in sort of how many loads you can put on those platforms. I think before we started construction, we realized we probably had to do pile reinforcement, which is a program we've been doing here for 15 years, but we had to do some significant, you know, pile remediation work underneath Wagner Park in order to develop the park we had designed. Probably not anticipated at the time that we'd have to do it. So it is about pivoting, I think, and just in terms of our Northwest project, which is sort of the next Battery Park City Resiliency project, we've had to pivot a lot and adjust a lot based on what we find. It's always going to be, you know, the battle between the subsurface infrastructure and I think to the question like what regulators will let you do and how you bridge the gap between what you want to do and what you're allowed to do. Yes, you may. We had always planned in this project and in our Northwest project for future adaptability. So we had been using MPCC projections, which are used across city projects, but we also wanted to make sure this is not an insignificant investment. And obviously knowing that projections always change, that's sort of the nature of them, and they have changed over the past 10 years, that we wanted to make sure that if we're doing this, we have a certain amount of adaptability moving forward so that if we have to make future modifications, the foundations of these flood walls will be able to take on additional height and those additional modifications. So we did build that into the project. There's not to say that 10 years from now we won't have to go above and beyond what we've planned for today, but we've tried to, as much as we can, build in that adaptability from the outset. Sure, no, ask away. That's a great question. So many resiliency projects are funded through federal funding, which the authorities' projects are not. We have bonding capacity and the ability to do that, so we issued bonds for this project. That is because of the fact that we have, it's called payment in lieu of taxes, is additional revenue that goes from our ground lease. It's very complicated, but goes from our ground leases to the city, and that we can draw against. So we issued bonds for this project. The project, of course, got more expensive. We had to deal with COVID. We had to deal with inflation, double whammy in that particular respect. But I think we've been able to make those adjustments. I mean, as you work through a project too, there are things that are gonna come up that are costs that you couldn't anticipate. I think we've tried to work in a universe where we work in contingency, we put allowances in the contract, and again, you know what you know until you don't know it. Somebody used to call it the known knowns. You you have the known knowns, and then you have the unknowns. And so the unknowns, I think, are harder to plan for, but we're trying our best to do that.
Perhaps you already touched on this. Were there any stormwater outfalls or anything throughout this waterfront park that were going to be relocated, or how do you manage any crisis levels into those outfalls?
No, that's a great question. There is a significant, which I probably should have mentioned, there's also a significant drainage infrastructure that was put in place as part of this project, not just a cistern, but we did replace tide gates. We do have a near-surface isolation system that runs up Route 9A, which is basically pressure-proofing manholes that helps to prevent from water from basically, backdooring into other parts of the neighborhood. So there is a full drainage system that we worked really closely with city DEP on, and we continue to work with them as that is getting built out and we're in construction.
Can you talk a little bit about the community engagement process and where, if there were any specific parts of the project that were modified or came out of that community engagement process?
I sure can. That's a great question. So as part of this, we did do a significant amount of community engagement. Once we started design, and obviously we did that through any number of forums. We had large community meetings. We presented at the community board. We did smaller engagements. And, as we moved to construction of the project, yes, there were people who sort of didn't like elements of the project. I would say an element of the project people didn't love is the fact that we were demolishing a very much loved community park and basically building a whole new park. People had a lot of objections to us demolishing the existing pavilion. As I said, they wanted us to make that part of the flood protection system, but given the age of the building and its condition, we couldn't do that. It was fairly challenging, very close to when we were going to start construction of the project to sort of have, I think no matter how much public engagement you do on any project, I'm sure anybody who's worked on a project can say this, there's always going to be people who didn't know that you were doing the project, who are hearing about it at the last possible second. It could be any type of project. And so we had a bit of that, and it was really unfortunate because I think personally, it maybe undermined some of the really good community engagement work we had done on the project. It led to, litigation on the project, which I'm sure people are familiar with. We did face litigation on the project. I think one of the responses we did have that came straight from the community was that we had a certain amount of square footage of green space in the park. As I said, it was a passive public space, and our new design had a smaller amount of public space. And what we wound up doing to be very responsive to the community feedback was that we actually increased the main lawn of the park to basically bring it close enough to the level of the existing, the previous square footage, which was really in response to the fact that when we looked at it, we really did not provide the same amount of green space. And obviously people wanted green space. They didn't want concrete. They didn't want it to be an amphitheater. They didn't want it to become something that wasn't a park. So that was something that was directly responsive, I think, to community feedback. I think also the battery flood wall design, and we went through several iterations of design there, was really responsive to public feedback, both from PDC and, like I said, from the Battery Conservancy and from city parks. Even though, I always say there's sort of community small c and community big C. The bigger group of, community members and stakeholders there, we were being really responsive to a lot of concerns about would we be shutting the park out? There's obviously a very large entrance to the Battery along Battery Place. Would be creating a park that didn't seem as welcoming. They had done a bunch of renovations. How are we changing that? There was the Battery Coastal project we had to coordinate with that was happening at the same time. So I think we tried to be as responsive as we possibly could be. I'm sure people are not happy with the way we did outreach on the project. And as part of this Northwest engagement, I think there's been lessons learned where we've tried to do every single type of engagement possible. We've done something we call walk shops. We walk around with people and talk about what's existing and what's coming. We, have done area-specific workshops so you can really get into the details of stuff. We've done big public meetings. We've tried to do everything in the hopes that we're getting to as many people as we possibly can, understanding we're still going to be in a place where somebody didn't know about it. But I think it's always a challenge, engagement. Yes. I feel very popular. You asked me so many questions. I think there are certain areas of the project where the answer is yes, because here in this MJH and Wagner Park section, we're further along. I think we did have our contractor, I shouldn't say think, we did have our contractor put in like a storm plan in the event, because again, we're doing work all year round. We're very, very lucky that New York has not had a major storm in a very long time. But we did have them put a storm plan in place so that areas that may not have been completed at the time could actually have some level of protection in place. I think we are going to be as part of both part of our WEDG, but also part of the ILFI, and I would defer to our Director of Sustainability on this because I'm not the expert, but have to do a certain amount of reporting of how the building is performing and also how the on-site features are basically performing. A big part of our joint permit application from the Army Corps is a habitat monitoring program, especially for that Pier Inlet area. So we want to make sure we're in the process of developing that now, but want to make sure that there is information to go out to the public. We can better adjust it. Really utilize our existing Battery Park City programming, which is significant, that run our BPC parks, run by BPC Parks, that we can integrate that into sort of that so more people get information. We've certainly had success. We recently put together a tree canopy app that identifies all the trees in the area, and that is publicly available. So we're trying to, as much as we can, find new ways to get information out to people. So I think the park will serve as a good example of how we do that and then how we model it for the Northwest project. Okay, if there's no more questions, thank you very much.